All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Sergio Marrero with Rebel One Live. Today we have a great investor that is joining us, Jesus Salas. I've known him for several years. He works at the Omidyar network, and today we're going to hear about his journey into impact investing and that space. So thank you, Jesus, for joining us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
And Jesus is also a Twigo fellow. He was a VC fellow at Rethink Education, Stanford University alumni, Columbia MBA alumni. So he's way I always tell I remember having the early conversations with Jesus when he said I want to do impact investing, and I said, it's really hard to get in, and he's like, well, I'm gonna do it. That's what I want to do, and that's what I'm gonna do. So, and he did that. So it's great. I love it. So this has always been impressive, and I'm glad you joined today to share your journey. So, but I'll turn it back to you if you can share a little bit more about the Omidyar network.
Yeah, certainly. So, at a high level, the Omidyar network is funded by Pierre and Pam Omidyar. Pierre is one of the founders of eBay. Whenever eBay IPO'd in the early 2000s, they started as a foundation. What was Omidyar network was exclusively a foundation, and then in around 2005, they got an LLC, which allowed them to do for-profit investing. And so, from 2005 until now, fast forward, they've been doing both for-profit and not-for-profit investing, and it's always been in a couple of different areas. And at a high level, the secret sauce, if you will, is this dual checkbook approach of dual for-profit and nonprofit. They've deployed over 1.7 billion in assets. Half of that has been for-profit, half of that has been nonprofit. And again, reverting back to this, they always take an issue-based approach. So the couple of those issues that they've looked at, which are now actually have now spun out into their own funds, and I can give you a better sense of what that means. Some of those are around financial inclusion, education, civic tech, and actually there's a whole host of them. So that now we have a lot of sister organizations, and that's partly because these initiatives have grown wings and in some ways been successful at what they've done. So to give you some color around that, some of the spin-outs that have happened over the last 2 to 3 years, one is called Flourish Ventures. They're the financial inclusion venture fund, effectively. The majority of their investments are for-profit, call it upwards of 90%, but they still have the ability to do nonprofit if and when needed. On the flip side, there's another fund called Luminate that looks at civic tech exclusively. And there, the equation is a little bit skewed nonprofit. So 60+% of their portfolio is nonprofit, but they still have 30, 40 for-profit. So again, the tools are the same, but the issues are different. And then within those issues, they develop into sub-theses. So at a high level, the big change that's been happening is these spin-outs. The vast majority of them, the only difference is that they're growing into be independent entities with new names, but the LP, the Omidyars are still the same, and that hasn't changed, and the work hasn't changed. The name has, and on the back end, the organization has, from a org change perspective, shifted. But that's at a high level what we are, and happy to delve deeper into wherever may be most of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely a unique model because it's not you're not just impact investing and investing as a into a nonprofit or a for profit that may be focused on change. You all are actually spinning up your own organizations and funds, right? That are focused on specific challenge areas. That's what it sounds like. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So to give you a little bit more color, the the most recent spin out that we had was Imaginable Futures, which is the education portfolio, and they they evolved. And again, this is before my time, but from what I've heard, and I follow them quite closely, they've evolved in how they work. So they have specific sectors that they focus on in the U.S. and then outside of the U.S. And this was done just the same way an investment thesis would be done, but they basically try to assess where are the issues, and then where can we try to put money to work in service of backing solutions. So for example, in the US, they really focus on two target segments. The first is education for children 0 through 5 years old. And the second segment is student, they call it parent students or student parents. I always get the two inverse, but individuals who have children and are trying to pursue an education. So through their mapping and investment thesis development, they've, for the US, have honed down on those two demographics of folks that they want to affect change, positive change for, and then they go out and figure out what are the solutions that exist that they can then back. So that's just to give you a color of one of the spin outs.
Got it. Okay. And what's interesting is and how does it normally, can you talk a little bit about that process? Because what's interesting to me, I did research on like venture studios that are starting organizations, but these seem to be, it's like a venture studio for funds almost, which is interesting. I haven't heard of that model. And I think maybe because the Omidyar Foundation has so much capital, they can effectively deploy it in this way. What's the process by which you all come up with a new initiative and decide, okay, we're going to set up an organization around it?
Yeah, and in some ways, it's one of those things where, like, a founder can tell you how they were able to reach great success, and it makes sound so linearly as they say it, but when they're going through it, nothing makes sense and everything is messy. And what I mean by that is, I don't think the initial onset, whenever back in 2005 they got an LLC to do for-profit investing, I don't think they thought this is what would end up happening. I think things were a lot more organic whenever they said, hey, there are issues that the Omidyars and the employees care about. They want to figure out how to deploy capital into scalable or solutions. And then what the spin outs, I think part of the major change that happened, which I can then now get into what Omidyar Network, which is where I sit under, can focus on. I think a lot of this change happened really with in 2016, whenever we saw the dual use of technology and the negative consequences that can come with technology. So really, I mean, the spin outs were happening before, and some of it is more just from an org perspective. The organization got to be close to 200 people. I think it was north of 160. So just from an org perspective and just outside looking in, people were kind of confused as to what was going on. So my hunch is that from one angle, things were just getting a little bit murky internally and heavy. And part of it also was these organizations were successful in the work that they were doing. There was interest. Some of the investments that they had made had scaled significantly. And so part of it was, to use an analogy that I think I've heard internally, is the kids going off to college. So in some ways, these issues developed as ideas, experiments, and at some point gained a lot of traction. And then now the spin outs is kind of letting them go. And they still get support from the Omidyar group. TOG is kind of like the holdco, if you talk finance. And now really briefly, where I sit under the Omidyar Network, we're embarking on a couple of different areas. A lot of it is nonprofit backing, advocacy, research, policy. But the two major areas that we're focusing on, one is Reimagining Capitalism, which happens with a lot of the work happens from our DC team, which I'm not under, but they look at worker power, looking at new economic paradigms, grassroots infrastructure. Again, that's more, they're in like the Hill, the DC speak, which I'm not policy. I'm under the beneficial technology team. And a lot of the work that team has been doing is focused on things like platform power, how to put checks and balances on the big tech platforms that we all use. That looks at things like antitrust, anti-monopoly efforts. We also have another set of folks looking at how can we work internally with tech employees to help them create more ethical products. Again, a lot of that is nonprofit, but I came on to figure out how for-profit still fits into our new vision. It's an evolving vision, so we've been very thoughtful around the investment thesis. So to your point around how does that happen? I mean, I think for what we're now looking at, it's happening as we speak for what I'm looking at. So TBD if this in 5, 10, 15 years spins out into its own entity, like some of the spin outs. But right now it's a little bit messy because it's like developing in any other investment thesis. You figure out what are the problems, where could you be value add, and what is the vision for the future.
Yep. I mean, it's amazing. And for those, we'll cover we covered the HBS case for the Omidyar network last quarter for some of the alum, and it's amazing that the family had so much capital, right? Embarked on this endeavor, but also it sounds like there's creative room to develop certain initiatives and see where they lead. On the topic of COVID and the changing environment, since you were there before this happened and you're there now, what has changed in terms of the organization's focus and direction?
Yeah. I mean, at a high level, no one knows what's going to happen, and it's funny. You see all these articles with folks pontificating because they've been investors through the '08 crisis, and again, at the end of the day, it's people's opinions. It's what their thought process. I mean, obviously, you're going to make as educated of an opinion as you can. I think for us, what COVID is bringing to light is it's accelerating some of the issues we were looking at. So, for example, on the policy side, my colleagues in DC, some of their work that they thought was going to take to the election or maybe post-election, depending on who comes into office, some of that work, because of the stimulus packages, was truncated to like last month. That's on the Reimagining Capitalism. On the beneficial tech side, I think it's forcing us to really reprioritize what are the issues that are most relevant to us. So for me and my team, we had a session where we basically asked the question, hey, what is pre-COVID, our strategy was evolving and looking like this. Now the world looks a little bit like this. What is the Venn diagram? Where is that middle section of what are the COVID-19, what opportunities have now come to light that still fit in with our strategy that we can continue to do our work in, but in this new world that we live in. So just to summarize, it's forcing us to reprioritize some of the issues.
Got it. And I'd imagine, especially now, some of the issues related to, well, education, but healthcare, disenfranchised communities just become more important because those are the communities that are disproportionately affected right now, right? That usually get, they're out of work. What are some of those? If you take a step back for you, what are the I guess most urgent issues that you are focusing on at Omidyar day to day?
So in terms of my work, we've done some research into misinformation and disinformation. We've also been looking at data privacy and security, which if you look at all the Zoom bombings that are happening, look at all the hacks. Actually, there's a huge uptick in cyber attacks that have been occurring. As again, we're still developing our thesis, and so these data points that are coming up with COVID are fitting into our strategy as a way to, for what I mentioned before, reprioritize some of the things that we were already thinking about. I think at a high level, though, if you like you said, taking a step back, under the beneficial technology umbrella, one of the major issues that this has shed light on is internet connectivity and how one could argue that should be more of a public utility, which it's currently not. It's privatized, and so people from rural communities or low income don't have internet because it's expensive or don't have laptops or whatever. So I think there's an interesting nexus around technology and connectivity where we're trying to see how we can be effective in that, given again our ability to do a mix of financial tools.
And I know you've had, we'll get to a little bit of your background and how you made it to where you are in a moment, but I want to stick on this kind of strategy and where's the world going for a minute. The Omidyar network, there are a few like large foundations that have enabled work like that. Where do you believe we need to go in order to accelerate impact investing at large? The model of VC hasn't changed all that much. Then you have foundations, and like where do you see impact investing moving, or where do you
Uh,
think it needs to move?
I mean, if you ask me, and this is me in my personal opinion, I think the more that we can get people from marginalized communities into positions of power, investor roles, I think that in and of itself is impactful. Why do I think that? Because impact investing as a sector, some could argue, has had a lot of wins lately. I mean, you have Bain and you have TPG that now have impact funds, and I'm not going to argue for or against those funds, but the capital is there. Um, how they're deploying it and who's deploying it, I think is the second order question, which I think is where the true impact could happen. Because if you have individuals from certain communities thinking in terms of investment theses, they know the problems that these communities face. They know the internet connectivity problem. If with the right tools and with the right capital resources, they can make stuff happen. We gotta make that connection. So, if you ask me, that's where I think that the biggest need is in terms of getting folks in positions where they can make those decisions. Which, I mean, I think folks like yourself and others are focused on this initiative.
Awesome. Shifting back to and again, if anyone has questions on the channel, you can just drop it in the chat. How did can you speak a little bit? I know that Omidyar Network more funds initiatives rather than direct investments, but can you speak a little bit to how Omidyar, when it does think about investing, how does it evaluate impact?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to be clear, like the spin outs, they're doing for-profit deals and nonprofit deals, which are grants. And I'm developing our thesis around how to continue doing for-profit deals, which is going to be VC. And so, impact is in the eye of the beholder, for better or for worse. So what does that mean? I think historically, from what I've gathered at Omidyar, they defined impact by, because they had already done the work of identifying the issues. So bringing back the education, they spent multiple years focusing on why these two subgroups, parent students and 0 through 5, so early education, they felt they could have the most impact in these two. And so that was that was a result of a lot of research that went into analysis and their investment thesis. And they therefore, whenever they made investments, because they had that lens of where they saw the gaps in the current world, and where they saw, whenever they identified entrepreneurs, whether they be for profit or nonprofit, they could then plug them into where they felt that was going to be impactful. So it might not be as sexy of an answer as saying, oh, we use Iris or Gears or anything of that nature. But I think because the organization did some of this experimenting, some of this really experimenting, I'd call it, around these issues, that afterwards they felt confident whenever they were deploying capital, that they were having impact in scalable solutions, again, whether that's for profit or not for profit.
Got it. Great. And shifting slightly, because I know your role, like you said, you're developing that thesis for VC investing at Omidyar. How did you end up in that role? Can you talk a little bit about the choices and the path you made to get into impact investing?
Yeah, this could be a long conversation, and I, for better or for worse, can't tell you the one thing that led to me, but I'll mention a couple of things. And I've actually written some blog posts on my Medium account just to help dispel some of my trajectory, because it's been a grind and it's a lot of hustle. It's a little bit of luck. So I mean, at a high level, I graduated from, so let me back up. In undergrad, I had some startup experiences. I interned for a startup company called Tala, who's now phenomenally successful. but I interned with them when I studied abroad in Chile. They were there through a program called Startup Chile. And that was my first exposure to microfinance and social entrepreneurship. So one key experience that I had. Another one was taking time off from undergrad to work on my own startup idea. Um, we did it from a hackathon, took a quarter off, had a prototype, a couple of businesses signed up, and things didn't work out between my co-founder and I. But those still stuck with me, those experiences. Fast forward a little bit, I did consulting with Deloitte, and then through a fellowship, left Deloitte and got placed with a nonprofit impact investor that was doing microfinance. So that was a little bit full circle, given that I had worked with Tala and they were doing microfinance. At the nonprofit impact investor, I was doing debt investing, and that was my first experience in impact investing and also in finance. And I felt like that's where I wanted to take my career, but I wanted to move earlier stage, given the startup experiences to train.
No problem. Yep.
Given the startup experiences that I had, and also just general high level growing up, I grew up in a first generation household, low income. My parents are hustlers because they had to hustle to make ends meet. So this entrepreneurial itch, I wanted to marry that with impact investing. And I also wanted to pursue an MBA. So the platform for my MBA and the driver really was moving into early stage impact investing. And I benefited from going through programs like MLT to help me really define what that looks like. And through MLT, I developed the game plan, or what I thought would be a game plan, to help me make that happen. So fast forward a little bit, I chose Columbia Business School because I felt that was the best place for me, for my goals. Some of the things that I did throughout those 2 years, one was I was a co-president of our impact investing fund, which actually has capital to deploy, and we deployed. I interned for Rethink Education my entire second year. I did investment banking from my MBA internship. Was involved in a couple of other projects like LTXVC with you. And then I wasn't going to graduate with a job, but I spent the entirety of my second year hustling, interviewing, had 40 plus interviews, 40 plus coffee chats, just that second year. And then bringing Omidyar network, I had known about them ever since I had joined the nonprofit impact investor, followed them closely, applied to multiple roles, kept getting rejected, kept knocking on the door. Ultimately, somebody said, all right, let's give this guy a call. And literally over spring break, during my second year, I had one call. She was like, hey, look, you don't seem like a fit, but let me refer you to somebody else. Maybe you could talk to them. They're looking for somebody too. That turned into being my now manager. I had a conversation. I didn't think, I had that interview. And then later on that week, I was in Mexico with my parents in Zacatecas. I flew to California for a conference at Stanford, a Latino alumni reunion. I had coffee with the first person that I spoke to, reiterated my interest, tried to poke out what gaps I thought they could identify in my background, then did whatever I could to make those gaps not gaps, and fed my boss some of the thinking that I was having around our conversation. And then a month before graduating, they gave me an offer, but it was only an offer for 5 months as a contractor. And again, another long story short, they ended up giving me a full-time role. But that is probably too much, but that just goes to show you that it's a little bit of luck, a little bit of effort, right timing.
Yep, absolutely. No, thanks for sharing that. And I know you also did you said MLT, Twigo. Can you share more about I mean, we also did MLT. How did the experience, like what are some other things that helped you along the way to make those right shifts?
Yeah, I mean, MLT was undoubtedly one of the main reasons why I was able to get to Columbia, why I was able to get such a generous financial aid package from them. I also participated in Twigo, which was very helpful. So I actually got my investment banking internship offer for my summer of my MBA before starting my first year through recruiting. So I spent the whole summer recruiting for investment banking jobs. I mean, that in and of itself was a whole story, and basically spent the summer recruiting for that. But because I was able to get my internship offer before starting my MBA, which is a huge blessing, that allowed me to focus on academics and my career. So that allowed me to really focus and take a leadership role with the student-run impact investing fund that I later on became co-president of. So, I mean, MLT for getting to business school, Twigo for helping me really break into finance. It's unfathomable where I would be without those two programs.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So I know we're almost reaching the end of time, but wanted to share if we could take a step toward for the founders that or for the we talked about like systemic issues that Omidyar network focus on and your journey to where you are, where in terms of you and where you want to go, what's next for Jesus?
I mean, much like you, I'm thinking 2 steps ahead. And I think taking the high level back, I didn't think I would get to go to a school like Stanford whenever I was growing up in the north side of Fort Worth. I didn't think I would go on to work in consulting. I didn't think I would go on to do my MBA. I didn't think I would join a Omidyar network. and I don't say those things to be cocky, but those things have been, like I mentioned, MLT Twigo. I mean, I did inroads, upward bound. Like, I've been helped tremendously, and I will never forget that nor negate that. But I say those things to say, you never know what the next ceiling is until you reach one. And so for me, thinking, I mean, my job first and foremost is to focus on my role at Omidyar Network for the next 3-4 years and really continue, because right now we're building something from scratch around this privacy, security thesis. So I want to see that through, but the long-term goal, call it 5 to 10 years. I mean, I want to be managing my own fund, ideally focusing in underrepresented founders that come from communities like the ones that I come from. And so that's what motivates me. I have a couple of things that I'm focused on. One is the Access Project, which is free VC office hours for underrepresented founders, where I'm still keeping true to my word and holding myself accountable. But first is doing well in my current job, and then on the periphery, planting those seeds that I can then sow later on.
Got it. Great. So for people on the journey, so many that are watching that are considering the impact investment field and looking to Jesus for advice, what's some advice that you would give them as you shared a little bit of your hustling journey?
I'd say you first and foremost need to define what you mean by impact, and you can't let others define that for you. So, and if you use that as your guiding light, like if for you impact means the environment, if for you impact means funding underrepresented founders, if for you that means XYZ, first figure out what that true north is, and then you figure out what the universe of firms and or funds that are doing that are, so that you can really narrow down where it is you want to work, and you can talk to them and figure out how to eventually work there or start your own thing. I mean, I think with folks that you have going through Rebel One, it's creating this flywheel for folks to see, hey, it's possible. I'm a product of that because I can see folks like Charles Hudson, who's at Precursor Ventures, who's a Twigo fellow. I see other folks that are doing. I mean, Harlem Capital folks, Jared Henry, they're my year of MLT and Twigo. So they're doing it, and we need more of that. We can't have those folks be the one and onlys. We need more of us. So I'd say at a high level, focus on what your impact is, figure out who's doing those things, how to work for them, how to get there, and or start your own thing if and when that's possible.
Great. I think we just had a question from Frank. He says, for people starting nonprofits, he started a nonprofit called Inflection Community. What are the caveats that new nonprofits overlook when they start up?
What are the caveats?
Caveats they overlook that new nonprofits overlook when they start up.
Yeah, I think the nonprofit space is a really unique one especially in the U.S., because we have like philanthropy here in the U.S. is not like it is in the rest of the world. So whenever I think about the foundations that I get to see just through my work at Omidyar Network, ideally you do the same thing, the same sort of exercise that I just mentioned around figuring out what is the impact that you want to create. And then you figure out who are the aligned partners that are doing that, and reach them so that you can collaborate. They can help fund you. You can figure out how to create how what you're doing is part of a larger movement and a part of a larger effort. Because odds are maybe what you're bringing is something new, but odds are that the challenges that you're bringing to light aren't new. And so figuring out what is the ecosystem of what you're trying to do to find partners, thought partners, again, funders. I think that's one thing that if I were to do a nonprofit right now, I'd be trying to figure out who are my peers, where is my network that I can lean on.
Got it. And maybe I want to touch on a subject, and the question before I frame around it is what role do you think nonprofits should like in creating a nonprofit they should play, and giving a caveat, like to give a little color. You have organizations like IKEA that people don't know is a nonprofit, more for tax reasons, right? And then I go back to my time at the Kennedy School of Government, and somebody from Google.org talked about answered a question related to when they decide to make something for profit versus nonprofit, and he said when we create a not if I can make an idea profitable, it's my responsibility to make it a for profit, because we invite people to solve a social problem. And I thought that was fascinating endeavor. So a question, right? You invite people to compete to solve a social issue. So I put it in your court. Is like what role do you think nonprofits need to play? And I'll admit my bias is, if someone can start a for-profit to solve a social problem, I'm all about it. So I just but nonprofits hold a very important place in the ecosystem. So I thought I'd open that up for you.
No, it's a good point, and actually I think this pulls up a broader question around the need for philanthropy as well. There's in the media, there's been things like Winners Take All, which is a book that has gotten some notoriety in recently, and that's kind of critiquing that people in power do things like impact investing or things of that nature, but never really challenge the status quo because they never want to challenge how they got power to begin with. But leaving aside that, to answer your question, I view things as if what you're doing can generate some form of revenue that's sustainable, then I think it comes down to a personal philosophical question of do I want people to have ownership? Because doing for-profit means that somebody owns something, whether that's you or investors. And then there's a gray area now that's popping up, which is like B Corp, which maybe you do case studies on, but that's for profit, but with a little bit of a twist. And I won't get into too many of the details. To answer your question though, in terms of nonprofits, I think if you think of certain hospitals or colleges, I think wherever you have cases that can't necessarily create sustainable revenue sources, that's whenever you need or want to turn to nonprofit structures to help tap funding that's philanthropic in nature, generally speaking. But again, if you have the ability to generate revenue, then I think the question is, what do you philosophically want to align with? Because you can be a nonprofit and generate revenue, as you just mentioned with IKEA. But again, that's more of a personal question around what you think is best for you and your venture.
Great. Well, Jesus, I wanted to thank you for sharing your insight around impact investing and the Omidyar network. For everyone watching on the live stream, this was Rebel One Live. Join us on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Time, where we interview individuals from founders and investors from the impact space. So thanks again, Jesus, for joining us.
Thank you.